Welcome everybody to this event organized by a consortium of organizations, Circular Innovation Labs, Chatham House, UNCTAD, with the collaboration of ITC and the European Environment Bureau, among many other partners. It's a very timely discussion as well on circular economy and international trade. We will have two sessions today. The session will be mostly focused on ground reality and plastics work from various perspectives, from the downstream and also from the upstream, especially from a major textile producer. And section two will be looking at regional dynamics. We have important regional dynamics on pollution aspects, on circularity in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa. Many of those practitioners involved in those regional dynamics are here present today. So without further ado, I just make some small comments on the plastics issue. That's a sector that UNCTAD is active along with many other stakeholders here present. We are trying to help both the negotiations towards a global treaty on plastics pollutions through the UNEA process, which is ongoing, and also assisting the World Trade Organization and the member countries in finding out how trade systems can help to reduce plastics pollution, especially by promoting alternatives and substitutes to plastics that are more sustainable to make, to use, to the environment, and also to yield potentially better livelihoods. Without further ado, I will send the first, I will start the first session, and I'll hand over to the moderator, Mr. Arpit Bhutani, who works for the Circular Innovation Lab, who will then introduce the speakers and start the first moderation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Enrique, and good afternoon to everybody. Our first session is about three wonderful experts on circular economy in plastics as well as textiles coming up to share their on-the-ground experience on circular economy in South Asia. So we have Carla Baldwin from, she's the Planning and Logistics Director at Plastics Bank. Then we have Mr. Anwar Abdullah, founder of Ocean Quest Global, and Mr. Zaki Salimi, Senior Vice President at Crescent Bowman. Starting with Carla, Plastic Bank is right at the forefront of managing plastic waste issue in South Asia. We would really like to know what are the on-the-ground challenges you face in waste collection, sorting, and getting the plastic waste actually ready for recyclers. We've often heard that it is very difficult to get non-contaminated plastic waste, and usually a lot of it gets rejected by the recyclers. We would really like to get your opinion on this topic. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me here. Thrilled to be sharing a little bit of what we do and our challenge. So Plastic Bank does operate in Southeast Asia. And what we see is that the common concerns and challenges that we have is always about the cleaning, the sorting, and the segregation of the collections. Mostly we have at the level of our members. So it's always a challenge when also the material comes from like households, because then they don't, in many of those countries, they don't have the habit of do the sorting of that material, the segregation of this material. So what we do in those cases is basically the collectors or our members bring those that material to our branches, and from there we possibly do what we can to do the cleaning, to do the sorting, but we empower them also to do that. So the value of that plastic or that waste is much higher, right? So another concern and issue that, not issue, a challenge that we have is the mismatch of systems, because in some cases, our processors, as we call, that are the recyclers, they would rather also like receive that material a little like not clean, not sorted, because they have the capability to do that, which bring also the value of the plastic a little bit down for those collectors. So we have those collectors that collects in higher volumes, and those are conglomerations of like pools of collectors that are linked with like a junk shop. But also we have that small individual that also that it's in that survival mode. They need the money, they need to bring that revenue for their home, and then they would rather to deliver a bundle of like material that it's not fully segregated or not fully sorted, right? So that has been our main challenges in those countries.
Right. And what really happens to the waste that is collected and is unclean and contaminated? Does it go to waste energy plants, or is it left in the biodiversity? What have you seen?
So we have a rejection rate of around 5%, but in those cases, when we are not able, because it's some sort of level of contamination, we have processors that have like it's part of our network. So when our collectors are not able to deliver the material for our certified processors, they usually go to another processor that it's part of connected to the government, which that waste will be turned into fuel or upcycle into another product. So in many cases, even if there is a rejection for contamination or any other reason that we cannot accept, but we cannot resell that material, it's always upcycle and then goes into different categories or level of quality of plastic and sold to other clients.
Right. Thank you so much for the insights on this. To all the attendees, whoever have, all of you who have questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A section, and after all the three panelists have spoken, we'll be picking up the questions, and the panelists will respond on that. Moving on to Mr. Anwar, who's the founder of Ocean Quest Global. And they are at the forefront on preserving and restoring coral reefs in South Asia. And in fact, doing some research, I read that around 11 billion items of plastic waste is entangled in coral reefs in Southeast Asia. And that's projected to rise by 40% by 2040. So welcome, Mr. Anwar. We would really like to know from you, what has your experience been when you and your team have done all these dives and have seen plastic waste entangled with coral reefs, and when have you collected the waste? What has been done to that? Welcome.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. And what happened in the ocean is basically the ocean is where everything ends up. So no matter it's flowing from the rivers or just dump into the ocean, everything ends up in the ocean, basically. So the challenges on coral reef is great because there are two ways that reef degrade. First is the discarded fishing gear, which is also plastic, most of them. And they're amounting to about 60 million tons a year of discarded fishing gear alone, which is plastic material. And then on top of that, there are the garbage patch, the Pacific garbage patch. Every ocean has its own garbage patch, which if this, what we saw is it degrades coral reef because it's blocking the light. Some get entangled on the reef and they cover the corals, and the coral did not get the sunlight and they die off. So that is the risk. On coral reef, basically, we are experiencing great losses of reef from fishing gear and from entanglement of fishing plastic material on the corals. And then on your second question is what we do with it, right? So ocean cleanup basically is a very weak countermeasure when it comes to plastic. Basically, ocean cleanup takes maybe less than 0.1% of the diveable area. The diveable area, basically people go diving on reefs around the world, and all the diving sites combined is less than 0.1% of the reef areas of the world. And then the activities that clean up is less than 0.1% of this area. So it's almost nothing. It never scratched the surface of the problem at all, basically. So I think the best way to tackle the plastic, besides cleaning up, which have very low impact, is prevention. If we can prevent plastic from ending up in the ocean, that's the first thing, to cut off the supply that is continuously going down into the ocean, is one. Secondly, so what we do with it, like abandoned fishing gear, for example, because plastic material is so cheap, plastic fishing net is so cheap, fishermen don't repair the nets anymore. They just discard it and buy a new one, right? So it's just like single-use plastic. It's almost. So you find them on every reef around the world. And I'm going to basically in Myanmar, for example, where I started the Ghost Net project. Some reefs is covered in 12 layers of net. And if we go back in history on how many layers and how many years it's been there, we don't know. Basically, when we remove all the 12 layers, we have tons and tons of this plastic material, net material. And at the bottom, there's nothing left. There's just bare rocks, no living thing, basically. So, and we are talking about just one single reef, right? And there are 280,000 square kilometers of reefs that is exposed to this on a daily basis. So the challenge is really, really real. It's a real challenge. Unless we have a system to process what we've taken out of the ocean, and also to have a prevention plan from plastic ended up in the ocean, and regulations so that fishermen don't just simply discard their unwanted fishing net into the ocean, is also need to be in place. But it's almost impossible. Yeah.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Abdullah, and absolutely agreed. While we do need to collect and sort what we have already done and what we're already doing at a very fast pace, whatever even Plastic Bank is doing and you are doing, while it is very important, but we can never win the race of increasing the problem by solving it, by collecting it, for sure. This really, with your practical experience also, we can, and as you have shown, that there is very less area that can that we can go and dive in and collect. It really shows the massive problem that exists. So thank you so much for giving these insights. There are a lot of questions coming in for both of you. We'll come back to that later. Moving to Mr. Zaki Salimi, Vice President Crescent Bahuman in Pakistan, one of the biggest jeans manufacturer. Welcome, Mr. Zaki.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here. We really would like to know, when one pair of jeans is manufactured, how much plastic fiber is used in percentage terms in it, and also want to know, why are we not using alternate fibers? even when there are options available?
Certainly. Thank you, Arpit. Just to give you your audience a bit of a background on denim. So traditionally, denim has been 100% cotton. If we go back 130, 140 years when Levi Strauss founded the blue jean, and then Wrangler also worked on it, a number of heritage brands, the product was inherently 100% cotton. So cotton can be recycled without any problem. Now, answering your question, how much of the current garment blue jeans contains polyester, that basically depends upon a number of things, but generally speaking, in our facility, when we crunch out the numbers, when we see how much polyester we've used on an annual basis, across the denim fabrics, the multiple qualities that we make, the multiple brands that we service, we found out that we are consuming approximately 5% of our entire consumption of fibers, which is polyester. So 5% may not seem a lot, right? But what it does is that 5% basically impacts the rest of our 95%, because there are a number of iterations that polyester appears in. So to begin with, we have poly cotton blends, which range from 6-7% to 15% in terms of polyester. We have filament spun polyesters, which go in the, I don't want to get too technical, but they go into the weft of the construction of the fabric, right? So that can account for approximately 20 to 30% of that fabric containing polyester. And then we have something that everybody loves, which is stretch. You know, we all love our stretch jeans and stretch pants, and that basically is 1 to 3%. But all of these iterations of polyester in any shape or form basically mean that product at the current scaled availability of recycling a denim jeans means that it cannot be recycled. I mean, there are pilot projects at this stage, mind you, that are working to address this problem, which means anytime you put a polyester into a cotton garment, then that renders it at the current stage, at the current moment, non-recyclable. So basically that's either going to end up in a landfill, or if the jean is lucky, it will go for a second sale. Not very many people consume secondhand garments at this stage. Obviously, we're working to mitigate that and working to solve that. So in a nutshell, 5% of our entire fiber composition is polyester, but it impacts a lot more in terms of its footprint.
Thank you so much, Mr. Saki. That's very insightful. And just by 5% of polyester in it, so it practically makes it unfit for recycling, because you cannot segregate basically the textile.
So the recycling, the traditional recycling is mechanical recycling that is accessible, and we have that in our plant as well, because we work with a number of heritage brands. And when I refer to heritage brands, their core business is denim and blue jeans. You know, they're not so much as in the fast fashion. You know, the fast fashion consumes a lot of, let's say, more technically advanced fabrics, meaning a lot of polyesters, a lot of lycra. So the heritage companies still remain inherent and loyal to, let's say, more cotton-based products, you know? So you're gonna have less stretch component, which basically means less polyester and less lycra, and in essence, less petroleum-based intervention in that jean. So we're lucky, but those vendors or those manufacturers, let's say, who work for fast fashion companies, there is a very high level of polyester in it, because polyester basically adds strength to that denim jeans. Because what we've done basically is we've taken something that was initially supposed to be a a dark, deep blue garment, which ages over a passage of time through your use of that jean. So across a time span of 1 year, 2 years, it's gonna actually become whiter, and it's gonna change its appearance. So what we've done is basically we give that rendered look through washing the garment. So the initial jeans were deep and dark blue. They were never washed, yeah? The consumer used to actually wash them. But because of the pace of the commercialized requirement of a lot of brands and retailers, all of this is produced in a greater variety of denim jeans, which means, we're recreating what will look like a 1 or 2 or 3 year old jean in the factory. So we do that through intervention, through, let's say, scrapping the jeans. So you need a very resilient fiber, and sometimes cotton, because you're reducing the weight, it needs support. So a lot of R&D basically pushed the polyester to become a component of, let's say, a partner with cotton. As for alternatives, we're working on alternatives. The industry is working on alternatives, but there isn't anything that's low-hanging that we can take right away and put that in place of, let's say, polyester, because in addition to strength, it also allows for, let's say, a flexibility in terms of usage of machinery. So you could run it on, let's say, old Sulzer looms or even new airjet looms. So it's very versatile when you combine polyester with cotton. So at the moment, it's not very replaceable. The only thing is that you go back to, let's say, design stage, and you start reducing the component of polyester. So designers have to become more cognizant. They have to intervene at that level. But then again, you have a consumer demand. The consumer wants their stretch. So how do you work around that? There are some solutions coming up in the market. There is recycled, let's say, lycra available. It's expensive at the moment. There is recycled polyester, but you can put a recycled component, but that basically you cannot recycle that jean again, so it doesn't mean that using a polyester that is recycled can allow you for that jean to be recycled. So that there's a catch-22 with that as well. But I'm glad at least, a lot of consumption of recycled lycra and recycled polyesters has started up. So that's, saving, let's say, the virgin side. And a lot of this is, a lot of this is driven by brands who have actually made greenhouse gas commitments. They're committed to, let's say, reducing their footprint by 40% 2025, basically. So they have to basically get away from a lot of petroleum-based products. H&M is leading the way on that. Levi's is also leading the way. So there are at, let's say, design or brand level certain interventions that are starting up as well that will hopefully allow us to rely less on polyester, make the product more recyclable, also have the strength in the fabric itself so that it can go for a, let's say, a second life through a used second clothing retail format. So there's a lot of things that are currently being worked on to increase the circularity of a denim jean.
Thank you, Mr. Zaki, and thank you for bringing this technical knowledge on textiles and the issue of and why it is there. There are several issues to it. There's design issue, there is demand issue, and how complex it is to change, and how complicated it is to remove them and go back to the original one, unless there is huge design intervention as well as consumer demand. So in this session, we've seen both the downstream and the upstream solutions, and challenges that are there in the plastics value chain, both in terms of collecting and recycling plastics, or in the stage of textiles and using of polyester. We'll move on to the question and answer session, where I want to introduce you to Ms. Leslie Sajou. She's an international consultant on trade and environment at the International Trade Center, Geneva. They are one of the knowledge partners of the event. And over to you, Leslie. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, Arpit, and thank you for the speakers for this very insightful presentation. I must admit that often I hear about circular economy from the policy and strategy level, so it's nice to hear from like more concrete actions that are being ongoing in Asia. So I will take some of the questions that have been asked in the Q&A and the chat box. So first, starting with Carla. There was a questions about the technicalities of the sorting and the treatment of plastics. Like, how is it been done? Is it handmade, or is it like done like automatized? Like, yes, this one question on that. And second, on the incentivization, like why household and even small businesses in the region are not incentivized to sort out. And it was mentioned that through cashback or e-cashback. Is there anything that is done on that front? So yeah, maybe if you can answer that to start with.
Yes. Most of the sorting, it's done manually, right? We have branches and collection points. And also we incentivize some of our junk shops and collectors to already deliver that. So all the separation, the sorting, and we have done by those collection points, those branches are all manually. So we tend to just train them when we engage them into our programs. We train them so they can be able to identify the type of plastics, so it can make it easier, but it's mostly manually. On the to incentivize households, we do that. Anyone can be a member of Plastic Bank. It just needs to register through our app, because we provide the whole traceability from the moment that bottle or that plastic is collected on the ground up to the moment that goes into the processor. And then if the client needs further, until it gets to the point where we deliver that requested by them. So we try to incentivize, and of course, like, as I said, we have small members and those are individual, but we have also pools that's why collecting from households, because the source of the feedstock changes a lot and varies a lot depending on also the needs. So we try to have everyone on board as much as we can, because the more powerful and the more impact we can do. I hope I helped that.
Thank you very much, Carla. And now let me turn to Anwar. And there was this question about how the coral reefs can be regenerated, and if it's the case, like how is the whole process, the regenerative process, taking place? And I think it can be linked to another question about like where are the most severe damages can be seen on the coral reefs, like. So yeah, I think this was the first questions, and then another question was about like this 1 million tons of waste that are in the ocean. If we are able to collect them, or they can be used to solve other issues that we are facing in terms of lacking raw materials in, for instance, infrastructures or construction sectors. Any ideas on that front, Anwar? I think you are muted. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. Okay, yeah, the first question, can it really be rehabilitated? Yes, of course. Coral reef is like just forest. If you replant and you systematically replant a lot of corals, you can. The challenge of plastic in this sense is not the replanting, because the replanting is you are planting corals. But the corals you plant will constantly be covered in plastic. Therefore, It's the problem was not planting the coral, not rehabilitating the reef, it's maintaining the reef, to maintain the reef from the threats of plastic. Okay, so it is the maintenance side, the monitoring and maintenance side, to make sure that the corals that has been planted for rehabilitation is not affected by plastic over them, like entangled with them or things like that. But then with the volume of plastic in the ocean now, then this maintenance become very, very time consuming and costly, because we need to have people every day going to look at the corals that we plant to remove the plastic that covers them. So we can remove like half a ton of plastic on our coral today. There will be same amount or even more on the next day, right? So it is a battle basically to keep the coral alive from the plastic. Secondarily, what will happen to the plastic that we bring up from the ocean? There are two things that happens. One, if you take plastic and you throw it on the ground, exposed to the UV of the sun, it will degrade over time. But some plastic, they are not on the surface of the sea. They are floating in the middle of the sea where the UV radiation of the sun has been filtered out. That means degradation of this plastic take much, much longer as compared to the one thrown on the ground and exposed to the sun. So if it takes 100 years for one plastic on the ground to degrade, it takes maybe 10 or 20 times more, exponentially longer for them to degrade. While this is taking longer to degrade, more plastic input is coming in. This is why the volume has become accumulatively so much, right? So to get this out of the ocean, it almost, I can say, not possible unless we spend a lot of money. Even if we spend all the money available in the world today on tackling this problem in the ocean, it's not possible. It's not possible. The only possible thing to do is to first cut off the input, prevention of plastic from getting in the ocean first. By stopping that, then we can work, I don't know how many years, maybe 100, 200, maybe 1,000 years from now, if humans still exist, we're still cleaning up the ocean. Yeah? Yeah. I think I answered your question, Leslie.
Thank you, Anwar. Thank you very much. And now let me turn to Zaki. And there is this interesting question about, like, based on your experience, what is blocking the textile industry from designing garments that can fuel a more circular value chains from the very beginning, let's say from the design process? And then what do you consider the main driver for companies to reach more sustainable production processes and to reduce their plastic waste? Is it like a business case, or like policies and regulation and they are forced to do it? Like, yeah, what are the main driver according to your own experience?
Thank you, Leslie. So first of all, we've set the bar so high that in terms of product, we've been creating product. We've been constantly creating product. You know, we've created this frenzy of a demand and the supply that the requirement for let's say a more circular product or something that can be easily recycled does not sometimes live up to the aesthetic requirement of customers. So there is a because let me lay it out. You know, so we have a consumer at one end, you have a mill like mine at the other end, and in between you have retailers and brands who come up with these amazing looks, you know, but they have standards. You know, they have strength standards, they have let's say scientific values that are associated with the construction of their product. Now, when you put in a recycled component to a fabric, so I use I shred the garments. I take back the garments, I shred them, I put them back into, let's say, a blended with virgin cotton. I am compromising, let's say, the initial strength level, you know. So there are, and if I'm able to make up for the strength, I may impact, let's say, the aesthetic value. It may not look the same. So first of all, we have this consumer frenzy. We have a requirement of retailers and brands who want everything to look identical to the other. So we're in mass scale manufacturing, every piece has to look identical to the other one, right? So you don't allow for any compromises in the system. Having said that, you know, people are looking, brands are intervening, brands are looking to make their models circular, but it has to begin at, let's say, design stage. And when I say design stage, it means selecting the material that is more prone to recyclability, one, or can give a longer life. Now, when you give a garment a longer life, let's say a pair of jeans, then you're actually giving it the ability to be sold again, or to be converted into something and be reutilized. So a lot of brands are working towards that. Unfortunately, it's more niche brands. You know, it's more, let's say, startup companies who are very concerned, who are driven by an agenda, driven by a concern. We're not seeing that level of impact or that level of intervention at, let's say, where the real volume is. You know, we're not seeing that in the mass market. But I think change does start small, and then it trickles to a middle scale, and then eventually people catch on. So there are organizations such as the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, which are working to influence, let's say, they have created a design kit that a lot of brands have accepted, and a lot of mills such as ours have accepted. We've committed to utilizing across the board 5% recycled content, aside from what we use from within our processes. So that's number one. Number two, brands are making commitments to, let's say, they are present at COP27, COP26. They are committing to greenhouse gas emissions reductions. So there is a lot of ESG commitments that are coming up on part of brands. Some brands, I'm not going to say everybody, but people do need to lead the way. So I think there is intervention there. So change is it'll take time. It will take time, but it has to be a confluence. You know, it has to be everybody in their own kind of, including the consumer. The consumer has to demand more knowledge about what they're buying. You know, they need to see a description. They need to ask for, you know, where is my garment made? What kind of cotton is being used? What is the polyester? Can it be recycled? Can it be resold? Maybe a product which has the ability to be resold has a different value. You know, people pay more. So our dynamics in terms of how our retail looks today may need to change. And I think there are signs that we are up for a change, because we're seeing a lot of slowdown. We're seeing a lot of inventories piled up at retail. Goods are not selling the way they sell. So perhaps this is the right time for a reset, you know? Sometimes you have to bite the bullet. So maybe we are at that stage, who knows?
And now that you have the floor, let me taking you from the design stage to the waste management stage, because there is this interesting question that is saying, before considering circularity of clothing, we may want to address the waste from the garment industry. And you think that they are still destroying 3 billion pieces. I don't know if it's per year or it's not mentioned, but what can be done about that, in your opinion?
So the mechanical recycling is fairly straightforward, right? So you take cotton products and you put them back into cotton products. It's easier to dye. You get more uniformity. You get a very consistent outlook, and you can have a new product out of it. I'm not talking about a downstream product. You can actually go for a higher value product, just as the wool industry works. But the problem is with all of our content composition issues, you know, adding polyesters and lycras and stretches, that complicates the process. There are some pilot projects out there. So without naming any names, they are looking to be able to, let's say, take the polyester away. So they make a pulp out of it, and they are able to segregate the polyester from the cotton and send the cotton for recyclability. But these are very, very initial. For them to scale up is going to take a tremendous amount of investment, a tremendous amount of commitment. And the other thing is that if Asia is supposed to supply these garments in the future, then some of that technology has to come to Asia. Otherwise, Asian companies are going to be buying fiber from Europe. So that's another, let's say we're going to be shipping stuff, you know, we're going to be spending more carbon to bring goods over. So right now we have some semblance of circularity by recycling plants being set up in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, in India, those who had plants in Europe. So we're seeing the startup of sorting, segregating, and recycling of consumer goods being brought into, let's say, places like Pakistan, places like Bangladesh, and they are starting. But it's the tip of the iceberg. I think it's the party's just getting started.
Thank you, Zaki. And maybe let me now turn to Carla. Is there, in your opinion, any policies or strategy that can be done at the regulatory level, policy level, that could positively impact the plastic waste generation in Asia? Something that has not been done previously. Any example of I'm working on the trade policy side. So if you have like ideas on that front, like what can trade ministries do to support this effort?
That's a good question. I would have to look a little bit into it, and with the responsibles for the country, so they could give me a little bit more insight. But I'm sure there are policies and there are alternative and creative ways that we could be able to manage better, or just to try to avoid a little bit more, right? All the plastic waste. And one interesting thing is, I think, is just when the industry just shift. We had locations in Haiti a few years ago, but 10 years ago, basically, in Haiti, we didn't have any plastic waste at the level that we had last year or through the years, because I think the change on the packaging for example, from glass to plastic, and then us not knowing, because the problem is not the plastic, it's us not knowing also what to do with that plastic. So I'm sure there are like creative ways where we can get it, and policies are really required. And I'm sure, at least in Southeast Asia, we are always working close to the governments to try to bring that awareness and try to bring to enlive some regulations that will finally and help us to achieve our goal, that it's, close the tap for plastic before, and stop plastic before it gets to the oceans.
Maybe Anwar, you can jump in on that question as well, and a more like easier question to address was addressed to you. Like, what types of plastic waste is most common in the ocean?
Okay. Recently, I've been working on one project. Actually, it's actually very related to this topic, because we are setting up a recycling plant of plastic, and it was in Egypt. The reason why we wanted to set up this recycling plant in Egypt is because when I went there and I was working on a project, on a coral project, and there's a lot of plastic waste, basically ocean plastic waste, floating around, and we did cleanups. But the question is, where does it go? Where do this plastic that we pick up from the ocean go? So nobody has any answers to it. And obviously it's going to a landfill, right? So I said, okay, I'm not going to do this any longer, because if we don't set up a recycling plant where I actually know where my plastic that I pick up from the ocean go, and well, I'm not going to waste my time and energy, right? So that is one view of it. And I started working. I'm still actually started working. I'm still waiting for the prices of machines that's supposed to go and to be installed in Egypt. In the meantime, we're talking about human mentality towards plastic. Okay, we did a research in Indonesia many years ago. So we go in, if I'm not mistaken, in Sumatra, one of the river full of garbage. You can't see water in that river. You only see plastic garbage. And we saw kids swimming in that garbage, right? So for us, we need to assess how much does this kid impacted by this plastic. So during a school holiday, we take 10 of these kids and we bring them to the pristine area on a resort. And basically there's no trash. Right the next morning, when we wake up, we go to their rooms, there's trash all over in front of their rooms. They are not comfortable living without it because they are born, they grow up, they play in garbage. So tell me, how are we going to educate people at this level to change, to be like us? It's impossible, right? So the only way is to, in a long time from now, if the infrastructure improve, that these kids grow up and their kids start to live in proper infrastructure where they are not exposed to this kind of garbage, then perhaps socially it change, right? But bottom line is, all this garbage from these rivers goes into the ocean, and where does it go? It pile up somewhere. It destroys something. It clog up some ship's cooling system. It clog up a nuclear cooling system. It clogs up everything, not just biologically. Basically, economically, it's going to impact us one day, right? And we are talking about the thing that's mobile, that's moving around in the ocean, looking to create trouble back to us who throw them in the ocean, right? So
Thank you.
that's, I think, my insight for it.
Thank you, Anwar. Yeah,
Sorry.
I think, yeah, a very quick word, Carla, because we are running out of time here, but yeah, a very quick word.
Just to say, and that it's very important what he said about how you grow up with. And that's why, for example, Plastic Bank also has school programs where we are trying to change the mentality on how people see the plastic, giving value to that plastic, because until then it's just waste. So you don't throw $1 on the floor and just live there. So that's what we are trying to just change that mentality a little bit slowly.
Thank you. So I think, yeah, there are still plenty of questions in the Q&A box and in the chat box. So I encourage the very wonderful speakers to just write down and exchange with the other attendees. And thank you very much for the opportunity to join you today, and have a good session too.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Leslie, and all the speakers. It's a pleasure to have you all. Moving to session 2, over to Dr. Jack Barry from the Chatham House. Jack.
Thank you, Arpit, and hello everyone. Welcome to the second session of this event. As Arpit said, I'm Jack Barry. I'm a research fellow at Chatham House. and I specialize in the study on the intersections between the circular economy and international trade. And we recently published quite a large report on this topic on how trade can help deliver an inclusive circular economy, as well as a framework for action on this topic. And we'll post the links to those reports in the chat soon for you. So the first session really gave us an excellent insight into the on-the-ground challenges with making plastics value chain circular in South Asia. And with this second session, we want to zoom out a little bit and try to understand the regional dynamics, what they are with regards to circular plastics and trade. And as a result of China's kind of national sword initiative, which significantly restricted the import of plastics and other wastes into China, this waste flow was then diverted into the South Asia region, causing all sorts of environmental and social challenges. But on the flip side, legal trade in high quality plastics can play a role in ensuring these materials are aggregated at scale and treated and recycled economically and safely. So the real question is, what's the future for plastics trade in this region, and what's it going to look like? And so for this discussion, we have three expert panelists to help guide us through this topic. And following on from the panel discussion, we'll open up to a Q&A with the audience, hosted by my colleague Peter Bartlak from the European Environmental Bureau. So to briefly introduce the panelists that we have today to discuss this topic, first we have Latifa Abdul Latif. Latifa and I worked on the trade framework for an inclusive circular economy, and so she is one of the authors of that framework. But aside from that, Latifa is an international trade negotiator specializing in the financial sector, and she joins the ASEAN Secretariat as the Assistant Director responsible for analysis and monitoring of finance and socio-economic issues, which include sustainability agenda and the ASEAN Economic Community. So welcome, Latifa. We also have James Baker. So James leads the Regional Marine Plastics Reduction Programme and supports operationalisation of the Strategy 2030 Operational Priority 3 and the Healthy Oceans Action Plan. And he also supports country programming and sovereign and private sector project teams in identifying and promoting circular economy activities within their programs and investments. So welcome, James. And then finally, we have Divya Datt. Divya is responsible for developing and managing UNEP's program portfolio in India. And she has a doctorate in environmental economics and over 20 years experience in applied policy research and environmental issues spanning diverse sectors. So really diverse but well-versed and expert panel we've got. So after that introduction, Latifa, if I could come to you first. As I mentioned just before, the South Asia region is not only becoming a hotbed in terms of circular plastic trade flow, but actually as an area for really ambitious circular economy activity. And a prime example is the launch of the ASEAN's framework for a circular economy. And given your kind of involvement in that and your role at the ASEAN Secretariat, I was wondering if you could give us just an intro, give the audience some background as to why the framework was developed and what's the strategic priorities for the framework and for the region.
Thanks, Jack. I hope that you can hear me clearly.
Yes.
Okay, great. So basically sustainability initiatives are gaining momentum within the region. It has always been there as part of the component of ASEAN's growth. But it's gaining a bit more traction I just want to maybe just to frame this conversation, because under the ASEAN pillar, there are three, under the ASEAN structure, we have three separate pillars. A lot of the work related to circular economy or the environmental climate-related initiatives are actually concentrated under our social-cultural economic pillars. That focuses on creating awareness, changing behaviors. But when it comes to the economic pillar, where I'm under, economic pillars have not, or the economic sector have not been really sort of like forward-looking from the environmental perspective. So what happened is that in the past few years, there's a lot more initiatives related to the economic sector that looks into supporting businesses to also transition to a circular economy. So there's a lot of realization that the need to transition is not just a moral obligation, but there's also economic reasons behind it. There's no market signaling so far, because there's a lot of work done on creating awareness, but the businesses do not have a structured pathway for them to transition, and there's a lot of things that need to be supported. Therefore, the framework for circular economy for the economic community was adopted last year, and this year we actually have completed the implementation plan, and there are 67 initiatives that are going to be rolled out next year. So there are three focus sectors that will be covered under the first phase of the implementation, and these are the sectors that are among the highest carbon emitters and also have the greatest potential for circular economy transition: agriculture sector, transport sector, as well as energy sector. And just briefly to share what are the 5 strategic priorities areas that we're looking at under the framework. First is standards harmonization and mutual recognition of circular products and services. The second, we look into trade openness and trade facilitation to help move along the circular products and services across the region. Third, looking into the enhanced role of innovation, technology, and digitalization. Fourth is sustainable finance and innovative investment, because it is one of the most difficult part to deal with when it comes to transition, mobilizing financing. And fifth, the efficient use of energy and other resources. So these 5 strategic priorities would be the main pillar for the region to actually transition towards circular economy. And of course, the strategic goals is to have resilient economy, to achieve resource efficiency, and also to go towards sustainable growth. And yeah, I think I'll stop there. And I'm happy to expand a bit more if there's any question or you would like to find out more.
Yeah, that's great, Latifa. Thank you. And it's a really good the framework, although it's early days for the framework in terms of operationalizing it. And you mentioned there's 67 initiatives, which is yeah, I look forward to seeing what those are. I think that's really great that it's even at that detail. But just the fact of bringing together the ASEAN group and region to think through together how to deal with these problems and opportunities is, when we've scanned all the policies around the world and regional collaborations, this is really, I think, at the forefront of thinking in terms of how to work together rather than just to focus on your national transition. How do you work as a region? So I think it's really great progress. I guess the follow-up question I have for you, you mentioned there's 5 strategies, and one that comes up time and time again in the circular economy and trade discussion is standards harmonization and mutual recognition. So, different countries are developing their own policies, whether that's on plastics or textiles or whatever, and it's quite fragmented landscape. So why do you think, particularly harmonization and mutual recognition, why is that so important for the region to achieve a circular economy? And can you give the audience, because trade terminology can be quite confusing and technical at times, can you give a kind of practical example of where harmonization and mutual recognition or lack thereof is holding back the circular economy transition?
Sure. I think maybe like you mentioned, it's still early days for ASEAN moving to a circular economy. Perhaps what we can share is an example of lack of, harmonization and what was the risk to it. But just to highlight for the standard harmonization, why this has been the focus is because, like you mentioned, the keyword that fragmented across 10 ASEAN member countries. The circular economy transition is diverse across the 10 countries. Some a bit more advanced, some doesn't even have proper regulations. So it is required to facilitate circularity of trade in products and services, and also more important is to promote greater transparency and ensure that there's mutual understanding of the product that move along the supply chain. An example that maybe I can share is there's this recent amendments or refinements to the definition of waste at the Basel Convention. So even that includes electronic waste or e-waste. So even at the even that all 10 ASEAN member countries are signatories to the Basel Convention, but the way it is applied and its understanding differs across nations. And ASEAN is actually a big hub for refurbishment of mobile phones, and we've seen time and again there's issues that crops up from this refinements or this definition of e-waste, because it may have different implications and it may slows down supply across the region, because every country in ASEAN has a different value processes for this refurbished mobile phones. So having a standard understanding of what the product is is really important to make sure that we can move along this or either you recycle or reuse or you recapture the value of the products. It can goes along the value chain, and it is highly important. And looking into standard harmonization, we have actually identified one of the key things that has been identified. One of the first and most primary things to identify is to map and catalog the different definition, the different understanding of circular products and services across ASEAN member states, because we need to be able to have a repository to also help business understand what does it mean for its different products and services. And also we are looking into putting in place traceability of the circular products and services across the value chain. And I recall and the conversation earlier on plastics, right? One of the initiatives that we are looking at also reverse logistics, so that we can also move back the product or the end products after usage back to the producers or manufacturers, specifically in the transport sector. So it's easier said than done. We have written it all in the documents to be implemented, but at the very least, all these initiatives were done in consultation with the private sectors, as well as the CSO, the NGOs. So we do have civil societies inputs and private sectors, as well as the policymakers.
Excellent, thanks, Latifah, and please feel free to put links in the chat to everyone on any documents that you're developing. I think it would be great to see that study on the differing definitions and really good examples that circular trade is not just the trade in waste that can be revalorized and recycled, but also reused goods, secondary raw materials, goods that enable this circular activities to happen. So it's a really complicated umbrella term for different types of trade flows. And thanks for making it a bit more tangible. So moving on, I think naturally to our second speaker, James. And James, I apologize, I forgot to say at the start, James is a senior circular economy specialist at the Asian Development Bank, just to clarify to those who don't know James. So yeah, welcome, James. And so during your time at the ADB, you've been specializing in implementation of circular economy principles, particularly in the management of ocean plastics and waste management, and looking at delivering solutions for environmental health in Asia and the Pacific. And building on what Latifa is saying, giving the introduction of the ASEAN Circular Economy Framework, it'd be good to get your opinion on that framework and how you think it might play a role in the plastics value chain in the region and the shift towards circular plastics in the ASEAN region.
Great, Jack. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me tonight. So yeah, you've both made some very interesting comments about the impact of the China sword impacting the movement of plastics around the region, the diversion of plastics waste, and Latifa made the comments about not just waste, but we're starting to look at materials, for recycling, for overhaul. And I think one of the interesting aspects of the international trade is this definition of waste and when materials cease to be waste. And I think that certainly from the framework point of view is a very interesting opportunity for us to both look at the sort of high grade plastics that we're starting to see, the bottle to bottle materials that are becoming more and more prevalent around our region, but also the other grades of plastics and how we define those when they cease to be waste, at what levels of purity, or what levels of processing they cease to be waste. And that is a key part of the framework and the harmonization of standards and the mutual recognition, not just from the benefit of being able to allow freer trade, but also the reduction of waste crime. The more we can identify, the more we can work with recyclers, with reprocessors, with aggregators to define these standards and have unified standards across the region, it will allow the circular economy to begin to operate more successfully. Certainly in small island developing states, we see this challenge with reverse logistics, where companies are very happy they can ship products transboundary with no issue at all. But when it comes to reverse logistics of the backward shipping of potential waste materials, then a whole new set of regulations come in and that limits the opportunities for that trade. And certainly, at ADB, we are working on a regional basis. We have a lot of support from the Global Environment Facility in doing that, to begin to harmonize behaviors both within ASEAN and wider, to begin to harmonize understanding and develop those communications between governments, between customs teams, between regulatory teams. But it's also interesting as we start to see the flows beginning to happen. So we have a situation where PET, which for many years has been widely recycled, is now diverging into high quality bottle to bottle PET and lower quality PET, which is, sort of almost a step backwards from a pure recycling point of view. But from a circular economy point of view, it becomes very interesting. It becomes, very exciting because we have that circularity, we have that bottle to bottle, but it doesn't help us. And the speakers earlier were talking about the degradation of waste that's been in the oceans, the degradation of waste that has been in landfills. And we're starting to see these products that cannot go into the circular economy because of this degradation. And certainly the work that we're doing is looking more closely at those degraded wastes, the ability to ship them, the ability to trade in them, the ability to begin to use new technologies to recover them back into value chains. And that's certainly somewhere that we want to work with. And I think as the ASEAN framework develops, that enhanced role for innovation, for digitization and emerging technologies, that tracing, that traceability will be a key part of this work, and certainly something we're looking at in our research to support our developing member countries as we move into the plastics treaty and the impacts that will have, is the integration of those digital technologies to allow traceability, to allow tracking, and to integrate with that more harmonized framework, that more harmonized market. And I think that as the future of trade for circularity develops is where the really interesting opportunities will be.
Yeah, thanks, James. Really good points. I think your points particularly around you need the definitions which subsequently drive the standards. But on top of the standards, you need the transparency across the whole value chain to enable them to actually function. And the transparency cuts across everything from informal waste pickers and something that Plastic Bank are working on, through to the aggregating companies, to the exporting companies, to the customs officials, through to the environmental agencies in the importing countries. It's a whole range of different types of actors that have to come together to make this all work. And you mentioned the plastic treaty, and that's so critical to underpinning how a plastic treaty could function. So yeah, really important points. I guess with your work in the region as ADB, you provide a lot of support in all these areas. But I was wondering if you had any kind of really standout pieces of policy or legislation that you've seen in the region that's really driving either the standards or regulations or transparency forward, or actually more on the industrial side in terms of plastic circularity. Do you have any good tangible examples of those and where they maybe could be replicated elsewhere?
Yeah, so for me personally, as we look around, I mean, a lot of countries are developing extended producer responsibility. A lot of countries are bringing in bans. A lot of countries are, but the interesting examples for me are the small island states again, and the Maldives with their ban on single-use plastics. And I think that's particularly interesting for us as ADB and for other groups looking at Southeast Asia, because although it's quite a small situation, because it is an island state, because it's a relatively controlled environment, we can see how those policies develop. We can see how those policies interact. And certainly my colleagues at ADB have been working very hard there, both with the general waste management, but also specifically with the single-use plastics ban, to understand how those regulations can be developed and transferred to larger countries, to larger situations. But I think the Maldivian approach has been very successful. I think their focus on the single-use plastics, on the water bottles, and some very bold moves, completely banning smaller bottles, completely banning smaller items. But for me, that's the standout one, because we can see the results much more quickly and we can see the results much more clearly. Now, obviously, it's a lot easier to work in an enclosed environment like that. But from a learning point of view, from a transferability point of view, for us, that's a great place to learn. It's a great place to see what is possible. And I think that is, for me, is the most interesting example, because from there we can draw learning, we can demonstrate principles, we can demonstrate effects very, very quickly.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And time again, you see small countries who are at the coalface of the impacts of whether it's plastics or climate change tend to be the ones with the most ambitious policies to solve it. And the point around how we learn from these, scale them up in bigger country settings is a really good point to end on. So thank you, James. And I guess moving from the small country to the large, Divya, so you're at UNEP India, and I wanted to pick up, I think I'll also give you a chance to reflect on what Latifa and James have said as maybe my final question to you. But given your really broad and extensive experience, plus 20 years in environmental policy research, I was wondering if you could give us an overview of the latest policy developments in India related to plastic circularity. I think that'll be really valuable to the audience.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. No, I think some very, very useful points have been brought up, and I can sort of almost see how relevant these are for the discussion that is happening in India, both sort of in the national context, but also with respect to what we heard the government of India say when the United Nations Environment Assembly was negotiating the plastics, the resolution leading, which eventually trying to lead to an international legally binding agreement on plastics. But coming back to your question on what is the government of India doing, I think, now in general, I would say there is widespread recognition within the government system on the imperatives and on the benefits of circularity. I think globally the numbers are something like only 8% or 9% of the world is circular. And while, of course, that is an area of concern, I think it also sort of highlights the immense opportunity that exists to move towards circularity and the kind of space that is available for innovation across sectors. Just to give you an idea of the importance that is being placed on circularity, I understand that one of the priority themes during India's presidency of G20, which India will take over in December this year, is circular economy. So in the Environmental Deputies Working Group, one of the priority areas will be circular economy. And, it is expected that, or at least we hope that plastics would sort of feature in that discussion. But just sort of coming back to your question on what is the government of India doing, let me start first with sort of giving a little bit context on what they are doing on circularity in general. So I think across sectors, whether it's plastic waste, e-waste, construction demolition waste, metal recycling, steel scrap recycling, vehicle scrappage policy. So across a number of sectors, we are seeing a lot of action and initiative to focus on circularity. They have recently identified 11 focus areas, which includes things like agriculture waste, municipal solid waste, etc., where the idea is to develop roadmaps to move from a linear to a circular economy. And the government of India has very recently, in fact, the UN Secretary General was in India to launch what they're calling LIFE, which is Lifestyles for Environment. And one of the things there is to really focus on behavior change to address this whole issue of, linear lifestyles and help, transition from the consumer side, help the transition towards circularity. But coming back to plastics, this is one sector, and like I said, there's been activity in a lot of sectors. This is again a sector where there is growing momentum, but a lot still to be done. I think the statistics for India are something like, of the total plastic consumption, about 42% in a year stays in circulation, meaning the lifetime of the product is greater than 1 year, while 58%, so the larger majority, comes out as waste. And of the total plastic waste generated, about 60% is actually recycled. So, there is a huge informal sector which is engaged in recycling, as we all know, but there are, of course, issues with the quality of recycling and whether it is upcycling or downcycling. So there are all those issues. But those notwithstanding, 60% of the waste is estimated to be recycled. About 9% is reutilized for energy recovery and repurposing, and about 30% is basically mismanaged plastic waste that sort of finds its way into drains and dump sites, or is openly or is burned. And there are various studies which say that there is a huge potential sort of running into billions of dollars, that the economy can save were they to recycle and were they to sort of adopt circularity more effectively, especially in plastic packaging. So I think these are, imperatives that are now well recognized in the government system. In 2021, the government of India brought out regulations to ban the manufacture, import, stocking, distribution, sale, and use of about 19 identified single-use products which have low utility and high littering potential across the country from July of this year. So the ban is already in force. And this includes a range of products from cutlery to earbuds to, ice cream sticks and what have you. So there is a sort of list of 19 products that have been banned. There is, of course, a lot of action now on creating awareness around the ban and helping people transition away. There are stocks already in the market, but beyond that, how do you sort of make the bans effective? both from the producers and the consumers side. And then in February of this year, the government notified guidelines on extended producer responsibility on plastic packaging. And these regulations set out roles and responsibilities of producers, importers, brand owners, regulators, recyclers, and waste processors for the effective implementation of EPR in the country. So those, I think, are the two big, pieces of policy and legislation that have been put into place recently to address the issue of plastic pollution. India, as you would know, was also a major player in negotiating the UNEA resolution to lead to a global treaty. One of the, if you've read the text of that resolution, there is explicit mention of circular economy and life cycle and the whole life cycle of plastics. There was some concern initially of, including upstream as well in the resolution, because I think the underlying concern is that there is a huge dependence of the economy, especially small and medium-sized industry, on plastic manufacturing. And without first having that part of the economy prepared for a transition, it would not be fair to jump into a legally binding agreement. And I think these are very valid sort of concerns, economic and livelihood perspective. But nonetheless, India did sign up to the resolution with, after their concerns were taken on board. And I think this last year, we've seen a lot of momentum and a lot of engagement of different stakeholders by the government of India to build traction for the ban as well as for the EPR regulations. I think the EPR regulations is going to sort of, the implementation is going to take time because there are different models that are being tried. But I think once it is proved to be effective, then it will become a useful framework, not just for plastics, but also for other sectors where EPR will eventually be adopted. So I'll pause there and, happy to come in with other aspects that come up during the conversation. Jack, back to you.
That's great, Divya. Thank you. A really good granular picture of what's happening in India. Everything from the ambition of the G20 presidency, which is great to hear. Circular economy is going to be one of the priorities there, through to the 2021 bans and the EPR kind of working with that. It'd be interesting to know, what are these internal policy developments in India, whether it's the bans, whether it's EPR, what effect does that have on the kind of global trade in plastics? Not just in terms of the flows, but I'm thinking how much engagement is there between the circular economy policymakers in India and the trade officers and the trade policymakers? Are you seeing alignment there, or does more need to be done? I mean, this is a common problem in every country. There's not really much discussion between the circular economy policymakers and the trade policymakers. Is this an area that you think needs more work? Have you seen it starting to happen?
No, I think that's an area that definitely needs more discourse. I think it was in 2019, if I'm not mistaken, that the government of India had actually imposed a ban on import of plastics. So this was before, I think, the amendment to the Basel Convention, and so this policy change was made. And prior to that, companies in India were importing large quantities of plastic waste from a number of developed countries. And these imports were not only significant, but they were also growing over time. But having sort of recognized the issues that this were creating, the government then imposed this ban. But I think earlier this year in March, this 3-year ban was lifted and allowing only PET flakes to be imported. So it was earlier a blanket ban on all kinds of plastic, but then this was sort of changed and qualified, and PET flakes now are allowed to be imported. But this was internally opposed by, various groups. And then there was a technical review committee that was constituted that then has recommended that the import of PET flakes should be subject to certain conditions. And these conditions essentially require that a unit which is importing, or a unit which is sort of eligible for import, gets the permit to do so only if it has also, if it is also recycling domestic waste to a certain extent. So there are percentages that are set, that something like say it would be catering to domestic waste to the extent of 80% and imported waste to the extent of 20%. And that there are various sort of nuances to this regulation. But I think the idea there is that we use trade policy to also promote domestic recycling and circularity. So while, so I think there is this two-way interface between national policy, because the ban will have an impact on India's trade, but also these restrictions on trade is also they're using it in a way to build local domestic capacity to sort of promote recycling. So I think those are some very interesting things that are happening. And like I said, even for the global treaty, some of these national sort of economic concerns were issues that were highlighted. And I think as this, as national capacity and confidence grows to address plastic waste better in the country, I think we should see more movement and more confidence within the government system to move forward with the international agreement, as we've seen in other areas like, climate, etc. So once you have your domestic markets are more ready, I think the governments become more confident about taking up targets, etc. So hopefully we'll see more of that happening globally as the plastic circular economy in plastics develops in the country.
Great, thank you, Divya, for that summary. And if I was to sum it up in a sentence or two, I guess, from the three of you, it's clear domestic circular economy policy has ripple effects along global value chains and affects others. And that really needs to be considered. But equally, the policies of others affect you. So there needs to be much greater collaboration, not just collaboration, but really strong harmonization and alignment between regions and countries to deal with these problems. The Plastics Treaty is a great start in that respect, but it really comes down to the devil in the detail for every value chain, and lots of work to be done there. So I'm conscious of time. I'm going to hand over, firstly, thank you to the three of you. I'll hand over to my colleague Peter at the EEB to pick up from where I left off and delve into the Q&A. So Peter, over to you.
Thank you, Jack, and good afternoon or good evening to everyone. Yes, my name is Piotr Barczak at the EEB, and my role is just to coordinate a little bit the questions and answers. Thank you very much to all the speakers, and thank you, Jack, for moderating. There are many questions. Some of them touch upon very domestic situations in different countries, but I would like to remind that the webinar is really about trade and how trade can be an enabler for circular economy, both in the importing and exporting countries. So let me pick up on some questions. So many of them don't know where to start, but let me start with this one that is very much related to trade, and it's to James mainly, but everybody please do chip in. So you mentioned about the traceability as one of the main factors to ensure proper rollout of circular products, so that and there were some questions or other remarks or doubts that data is not reliable. How would you see this tracking and traceability be operational in practice? In fact, how the data could be exchanged? Possibly, do you see the tools such as digital product passport as an enabler for this traceability? Digital product passport, which is the tool based on blockchain information, but maybe there are other. Please, James, on traceability.
Yeah, so there's a couple of points of view on traceability. We are looking at it from a point of view of financing mechanisms related to the Global Plastics Treaty, essentially to be able to capture waste that is collected, waste that is recycled, and prevent double counting, prevent the same materials being returned twice for a separate payment. We're looking at using app-based technology from very much a ground level, moving up into enterprise level software. But that is based on, barcoding QR codes of specific batches of specific groups of material that passes up through the aggregation. Now, from an ADB point of view, that's very interesting because it then allows a fund flow going back down through the same system, so that any funding mechanism can actually direct the funds down to the waste collectors, the people who are collecting it. There is a wider discussion about using traceability, using systems, and one of the questions I saw was in the Internet of Things, as how we start to use that digital technology to track, to trace. The IoT technology is slightly too expensive to use on individual items. If you want to be tracking containers, if you want to be tracking shipments, then it is ideal. But if you want to be seeing how products from a specific manufacturer are traveling through the system, then chemical watermarks, QR codes, those types of activity, possibly even RFID tags are more successful and more cost effective. You mentioned the blockchain system, and of course, blockchain in itself is a record keeping system. You know, it's a disseminated record keeping system, and I think that the blockchain will provide that necessary check and balance on these activities. What we're struggling to do, or what we're looking at and learning how to do at the moment, is develop app-based systems, develop phone-based systems that can capture the material successfully. They are not data hungry. They are not reliant on top of the line phones. They are accessible to wide ranges of the community that can then feed into that system. One of the sort of, as we're starting to do this research, one of the very interesting sort of assumptions that we all make is, oh yes, we've got an app that works, but you don't realize how much data it uses. And that's just not tenable for people who are surviving on pennies or US cents per day. So there certainly is a really valuable place for technology in tracking plastics, in promoting these circular economy and these trades, but it's not quite as simple as you would first have thought to implement it. Thank you.
Thank you, James, for sure. So thanks for those mentioning those different tools. And at one point you mentioned what that struck me, and is really important, is that using traceability can also enable funding flows. And here EPR can be also flowing together with the product. Especially one of the speakers said today that when it comes to waste imports or exports, we should also think about imports and exports of second-hand products. One of the speakers said, where importing countries can repair, refurbish the product, second-hand product. But the question is there, what about the EPR, whether the EPR will also follow the product for those activities such as refurbishment and repair? So, but for this, of course, the traceability, the flows of data is very important, so that the funding can also flow together with it. And it brings me actually to the second question, two questions actually to Latifa. Which you represent the ASEAN. One of the participants questioned you whether how the standards are being developed. What are the barriers for the standards in such a broad community such as ASEAN? You know, it's I don't know how many countries, but dozens of countries are in this, or a dozen of countries there, with very different criteria, different conditions. And different backgrounds. So how is possible that the different that you can come up with a single strategy to reach circular economy with all those different stakeholders? How you manage to reach any kind of conclusions and agreements also for standards? And following up questions, whether with this in mind, such a diverse situation in ASEAN, do you think it is ever possible to reach circular economy ambitions by ASEAN? That is a broad question by one of the participants.
Yes, both are difficult questions, and I don't intend to to have all the answers. But what I can share with you in terms of harmonization, yes, you rightly pointed out. There are 10 countries in ASEAN with different levels, like I mentioned, different levels of development, different levels of understanding of what circular economy is. And we are really taking baby steps in moving towards a circular economy model. And one of the biggest hurdle is capacity. This is one of the biggest component of our initiatives to a circular economy in building capacity of our standard regulators body in customs officers, in understanding, in building up the consensus towards harmonization. And I think it's the first step, like I mentioned earlier, the first step that we're doing right now is not, we don't expect to have harmonized standards overnight or even within 1 or 2, 3 years. It's going to be a very long process. And the first step that we're taking is first mapping each individual ASEAN member states' state of play with regards to regulation, identifying the regulatory distance, and really understanding where we can land, what is the landing zone. And although that I say it's going to take several years, but there are some incentive to actually expedite the process, because for just to share, the one of the things that perhaps would be quite substantive in terms of ASEAN's transition to circular economy is that there would be inclusion of circular products in our upgrading of ASEAN free trade agreements negotiations next year. So in our upgrading of that negotiation, the ASEAN FTAs, the circular products will be included, and in doing so, you must be able to have at least a certain level of understandings on the products, and there's some incentive to actually move towards that. I'm not sure how fast we can move, but the political will and the will to move is there, and we are really optimizing that momentum, and hopefully that we'll be able to sit together and try to work out something. But like I mentioned, capacity is one of the biggest hurdle, and that's where we need to first tackle in moving towards harmonization. And moving on to your second question, can you remind me again the second question? What
well, the second question was even broader, whether do you think it is ever possible?
Yes.
Circularity.
Well, it's not to say ever possible. I think the question is, when can we actually move to a circularity? Because it's inevitable. In fact, I just can't. The ASEAN leaders is having a meeting right now. And one of the key issues that has been raised by the leaders again, time and again, is the carbon neutrality, and circular economy is one of the key pillars to move towards carbon neutrality. So it is a goal that needs to be achieved by the region. But of course, what we're doing at ASEAN is looking at the regional perspective, because what ASEAN is looking at is to complement the initiative by each ASEAN member countries. So of course, like I said earlier, whether ASEAN can move to a circular economy is not a question, but the question is actually how fast can we actually move? How can we accelerate? How we can scale up? Because we really need to move towards a more resilient use of resources, and I think that is a shared goal globally.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Latifa. Maybe I can just complete that. Very recently, right? There was a new stakeholders platform set up with the Secretariat in Bangkok in September. Yes, and this is very much in linkage with the EU, where both the EU were also the opening launching at the event. And this exchange of different stakeholders platforms with the joint consultation processes and best example sharing can really maybe speed up and keep the ambition high, keep the energy high also, and not to just think about complaining that it is not possible to reach. We have to reach it. The question is how fast. Indeed. Thank you very much. A few questions to Divya Dutt, Dr. Divya Dutt from India. Myself also, I just recently, very few times I've been to India and observed the situation, and it's about plastics. There were questions about this, both about the single-use plastic directive, single-use plastic initiative. Indeed, we see still that those single-use plastics are still available on the market. Question whether businesses were prepared enough with alternatives for this substitution or not. Actually, the question that is overlapping from the participant is as follows: are there policies that have come up on trade and circular economy? Is there support to the industry in terms of capacity building with such ambitious plastic targets? So basically, similar to what I said, there are ambitious policy measures in India, we recognize that, also EPR and bans, but is business ready for that? And secondly, how those measures can also improve the situation for imports and exports or trade relations between India and the EU as well?
Yeah, so lots of complicated issues in that question, but on whether industry was prepared, I think there was enough sort of lead time that was made available. I mean, enough or not, but there was some lead time made available because the intention of the government to ban was announced, I think, in 2021, and then the sort of ban effectively took place in July 2022. So there was an advance intimation. But, you know, I would agree in the past also at the state subnational level, there have been plastic bans that have been introduced and then they have been rolled back because, you know, of an outcry from industry and because industry wasn't ready, especially, like I said earlier, the medium and small scale industry. So I think there is this issue, and I would say that for all the products that have been banned, there are not adequate alternatives always available. But I think the strategy also of the government is not to make alternatives in terms of other products, but also to promote reuse. So, you know, cloth bags instead of plastic, rather than sort of introducing other materials, use what is already available. But you're right. I mean, this is something that requires, you know, more hand-holding for the industry, especially the small industry, in terms of technology, in terms of sort of various financial instruments to support the industry. And there is some discussion happening now on EPR. There is a lot of capacity building work that's happening. So across the country, the Ministry of Environment is organizing capacity shops for industry to sort of familiarize them with how this whole model is going to operate, taking on concerns on board. So I think they're going through that phase right now where they're a little lenient in enforcement because they're trying to build capacity. But once they feel that there is some amount of preparedness, they will probably be more stringent in the implementation of the regulation. But I think in general, alternatives are, you know, a tricky issue because many of these alternatives may actually have their own environmental, you know, impact. And how do you sort of evaluate the environmental impact of one alternative over another, or over plastic for that matter, is something that requires a lot of analysis. And therefore, I wouldn't really expect any state government or national government to actually prescribe alternatives to plastics. And this is something that, you know, and at UNEP, what we've been saying is it is the single-use nature of a product that is problematic, not just the fact that it is plastic. So any single-use product is problematic. And the important thing is to move towards multiple use, reuse of products. And that is really what we are pushing for globally and in the country. So I think when we talk about alternatives, it's important to consider some of these issues, you know, especially with respect to the environmental footprint of other options that may be being promoted by industry in the market. So I think those need to be evaluated carefully before they are promoted by the government or supported by the government.
Indeed, thank you. From my side, I can tell that such life cycle analysis of different alternatives are already being done in different regions of the world. So sometimes it's better not to reinvent the wheel, but really to use the stakeholders platforms and check it, cross-check it with different geographies.
Yeah,
we can also.
I mean, UNEP has itself done some of these life cycle analysis. We've done a meta-analysis of studies, and we are using some of those available sort of studies and some of that available information from global studies to inform and create awareness among stakeholders in India.
Thank you. I don't know how much time we still have, but there is one more question, which is very much related to trade, maybe James or anyone else. It is when we talk about trade of products and packaging, or that is packaged, how possible that in this international trade, thousands of kilometers away sometimes, is it possible to enforce or even enable or favor reusable solutions? You know, is it possible? I'm thinking about the pallets, you know, the typical wooden pallets. They should have a standard and they can be traded back and forth. But are there other possibilities? I think, James, you answered in the questions, in the answers, some beer kegs. I can imagine beer kegs between Germany and Denmark being exported and imported, but would it ever be possible in a long distance trade? Or what kind of reusable, what kind of reuse can we promote in long distance trade of products?
So you already see, I mean, as I mentioned in the answer, we're already seeing 20 and 40-foot containers as the ubiquitous item being traded backwards and forwards. And, you know, beer kegs, whilst being very niche, all over Asia, there is, you know, Western American beers delivered in kegs. The challenge that you have here is the weight. It's the carbon footprint of shipping those items globally. You know, the question is, yes, we can, is whether we should. You know, and this is the move towards localization. And I think this is one of the things we're going to see with circular economy is that trade becomes increasingly localized. We still have to look at transboundary shipments, but it will be shipments within a region unless it is a particularly high value product or a particularly sought after product that merits the costs, merits the environmental challenges of long distance shipment. I mean, we've seen that, you know, the international shipping industry at the moment is making huge profits. They have, I think I saw 2% of global carbon emissions coming from the shipping industry. We're very used to having global products available to us wherever we travel. And the question is, as we move forward into circularity, but particularly sustainability, is whether that should still be the case. I think we are capable, there are products and packaging that can support that, but it's whether it should be able to. And I mean, I think the other thing to think about is that the list we've just given of these reusable packaging systems is they are products in themselves. They are very high value pieces of equipment in themselves. You know, a shipping container is $5,000–$10,000 to buy new. You know, a beer keg is sort of $300–$400 to buy. So there are costs, both environmental and financial, involved in that. And this becomes the larger question of circularity, the larger question of sustainability, is globalization a sustainable solution for us?
Thanks for this conclusion. That sounds very much with me. Trade should be localized in order to be circularized, really. That would be more effective. But international trade is still there to be with us. And we will, in different sessions, we will, together with you and others, we will explore more on how to make trade more circular. If Latifa and Divya would like to chip in into this topic still on reuse in international trade. Otherwise, we will stop the question and answer session, or would you like to still? Okay, I got information. We should wrap up now. So thank you very much, and I will now hand over to Apurva for concluding remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Piotr. It's been a fantastic event with immense highlights, insights from both the sessions. You know, the speakers from our first session highlighted a range of on-the-ground challenges in South Asia, ranging from contaminated plastics, unfit for recycling, to the impact of plastics on plastic leaching onto our natural environment and the effect on coral reefs. And some really great insights on how to tackle plastics in textiles and how interventions on the design stage are critical to solving this problem. And at the same time, the second session shared some very interesting perspectives from the policy side, both from the ASEAN region, from India. We heard about the ban on single-use plastics in Maldives, in India, and some of the EPR regulations in India in place that could be a useful framework for not just plastics, but other product streams as well. I think one very interesting thing that James mentioned was, you know, how technologies need to be inclusive in these regions to attain scale and to get that traceability that will be a mechanism for enabling circular trade. And one thing that was one of my key takeaways and something that I was really happy to hear was about all single-use products are a problem and not just plastics. So thank you so much, Divya, for sharing that really insightful piece of information. And with this, I'd like to thank all our panelists, our moderators, Arpit and Jack, and a special mention to Leslie and Piotr for who conducting a very immersive and engaging Q&A session. I would also like to thank all our partners, the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development, Enrique, who has been one of the core teams on putting together this event, Chatham House, a special mention to Patrick, and the International Trade Center, and of course, the European Environmental Bureau. And finally, a big thanks to our audience who's been really engaging in this event and have been posing some really interesting questions. I really wish you a great rest of the day and week ahead. Thank you so much for joining us today.